For 300 years, the most powerful nations on earth grew richer and stronger on the profits of the slave trade. Over 12 million men, women and children were forcibly transported from Africa on slave ships like this to the colonies and plantations in North and South America. Today, slavery is illegal in every country on the planet. But the truth is, slavery did not die in the 19th century. It is alive, it is thriving, and it is bigger than ever.
We've traveled across 4 continents, investigating the hidden world of modern slavery, from Pakistan to Haiti, from Europe to Brazil. Our journey ends in Washington, D.C., the capital of a country which only a few generations ago tore itself apart over its role in the historic slave trade, and which today is leading the fight against 21st century slavery. We've come to Decatur House, just a short step across the park from the White House. It's chilling to think that just 150 years ago, American government officials actually kept slaves behind these very walls. This is where they were quartered. And this courtyard was where they would saddle their masters' horses. Today, Decatur House is a National Historic Monument, and tonight it's the location for an historic television event. A unique public debate broadcast worldwide on the roots of modern slavery and how to end it for good. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Decatur House and to the Al Jazeera debate on modern slavery. This evening, we're here to investigate why it is that slavery persists in the 21st century and what we can do to eradicate it. And we'll be taking questions from our audience here this evening, and also questions that have been asked by viewers to our series. And to help us answer these questions, we have a very distinguished panel on this debate tonight. Ambassador Louis de Backer is the Ambassador at Large at the US State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. Kevin Bales is the author of 5 books on modern-day slavery and co-founder and president of Free the Slaves. Joy Ezeilo is the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. And David Batstone is the co-founder and president of the international anti-slavery organization Not for Sale. Good evening and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and also to our audience. I mean, let's start off with some fundamentals, which is exactly how is it that we define slavery in the 21st century? Kevin Bales.
Well, if you actually look at people in slavery and say, what's the common elements here, you find that they're always the same and really have been throughout history. The complete control of one person by another. Violence is used to maintain that control. And then economic exploitation. Now, when we're in the field and we're not absolutely certain, is this a slavery case or not, we'll often start with a rule of thumb question, can this person walk away, even if it's into a worse personal situation? And if they can't, then it's a likelihood that they really are in slavery.
And where does this exist? I mean, are we talking about specific areas, Ambassador de Backer, that this issue of slavery is concentrated? Where is it taking place?
But of the 190 odd countries in the world, we haven't seen any place where this doesn't touch. Whether it's a small island nation in the Pacific, like Palau, or whether it's the largest countries in the world, like India, China, the United States, it's a hidden crime, so we have to go out and do the hard work to be bringing it out of the shadows.
I'd like to go to our first question in the audience this evening.
Hi, this is for Ambassador C. de Backer. Do you feel that the State Department has raised the issue of human trafficking at a sufficiently high level in its diplomacy with the Persian Gulf?
Well, the easiest answer to that is I was in Qatar and the UAE and Oman just about a week ago, and it was something that we discussed with the ministers of justice, certainly with the ministers of labor. And the Gulf countries are now looking at how do they not just make labor policies with the idea of labor being the men that are building the skyscrapers or things like that. But for the first time, starting to see that woman who's cleaning the house as somebody who deserves to be protected.
We said at the beginning we want to look at and debate why slavery persists in the 21st century. What are the explanations?
There are a variety of factors why people are trafficked. These include poverty, inequalities, social exclusion, gender discrimination, lack of opportunities. So when people are in this kind of situation, they are very desperate to escape their environment and then to move to where they consider favorable environment and conditions. So it's a lack of human security.
When you use the word slavery, it does, in the historic sense, conjure up certain images in all of our minds. But I want to know, what forms does it take? David?
Just this last week, I was in northern Thailand. We had children who were being trafficked, like Slumdog Millionaire, the movie, to be beggars. Others were being forced into manufacturing. Others were being trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation. And then others from across the border in Myanmar were being trafficked to fight in war. So this is in one spot on the earth. If we were to multiply that around the world, we'll see similar types of cases.
Well, we want to give a face and a voice to those people who are in slavery today, and we met many of them throughout the year of filming for this series. Let's take a look at this next clip, which shows the voices and faces of modern-day slaves.
Com trabalho de escravo, você na praia é tipo amarrado a tua perna. Você está amarrado num canto, você não pode sair.
सर जी इस तरह के ਅਸੀਂ ਪਹਿਲੇ ਮਿੱਟੀ ਖੋਦਨੇ ਆ ਲਿਹਾਜ਼ਾ ਇਹ ਕਿ ਅੱਧੀ ਰਾਤ ਤੱਕ ਅਸੀਂ ਉਹਦਾ ਇੰਤਜ਼ਾਰ ਕਰਨੇ ਆ 2 ਘੰਟੇ ਸਿਰਫ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਰਿਮਾਂਡ ਮਿਲਦਾ 24 ਘੰਟਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਅੰਦਰ ਸਿਰਫ 2 ਘੰਟੇ
We were locked in prison. We were not paid at all. If anybody refused to work, they would be beaten.
ਸਾਨੂੰ ਤੇ ਕੋਈ ਉਮੀਦ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਇੱਥੋਂ ਨਿਕਲ ਸਕੇ ਸਾਡਾ ਦਾਦਾ ਵੀ ਇੱਥੇ ਮਰ ਗਿਆ ਪੱਠੇ ਤੇ ਹੀ ਤੇ ਸਾਡਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਮਸਲਨ ਕਿ ਬਾਪ ਵੀ ਮੇਰਾ ਬੁੱਢਾ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ ਆਪ ਵੀ ਮੈਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਬੁੱਢਾ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ ਦੇਖ ਲਓ ਮੇਰੇ ਬੱਚੇ ਵੀ ਨੇ ਕਿ ਗੁਲਾਮਾਨਾ ਜ਼ਿੰਦਗੀ ਜੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਗੁਲਾਮੀ ਦੀ ਹਾਲਤ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੀ ਆ ਅਸੀਂ ਆਪਣੀ ਆਜ਼ਾਦੀ ਦੇ ਅੰਦਰ ਕੰਮ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰ
คนไทยที่มาทำงานเพื่ออนาคตที่ดีเพื่อชีวิตที่ดีไม่ได้ต้องการอะไรมากกว่านี้ขอบคุณครับ
Ma praia vai tua mulher bale, vende pour lui, aí ça me fait manger pour lui, aí me laver pour lui. E quando ele bat moi chaque jour qu'on a joué, dès font bagarre il a joué, pour n'importe qui bagarre il joue.
C'est méchant. Des fois quand a bon frapper tête moi non mi. Tête moi plein tourner tête moi là. Que des fois l'aime quand vient sortir l'école, l'aime quand vient faire travail moi, les mari me vers zone 4 pour me pas sortir pour me te capable jouer à l'autre petit monde dehors.
Est-ce que vous voulez tourner la caillou?
Oui.
Pour qui ça?
Pour me garder beaucoup de maman.
आपस में गाड़ी चलावे तो जैसे गाड़ी चलाए ना होंस लाया और होंस ला कर इन्हें अंधा पे दे दिया फिर उसका पैसे में ना डटी उस आपस में फिर एक दल्ला फिर दूसरी जगह बेच दिया
लुई मारे कूटे बस चल काम पे गाली दे एकदम दिन लुरा तो गाली दे मारे गर्मी में काम करी धूप पर से धूप पड़े नीचे काम करे एकदम पसीना खराब हो जाए एकदम दिमाग नो फिर कोई जिंदगी ना घर पे जाते मंजूरी करे घर पे जाते फिर आदमी मारे कूटे क्या फायदा ऐसे ऊपर अल्लाह मौत दे दे
Ambassador Dabaka, what are the factors and forces that makes people begin this journey that ends up in slavery?
What the traffickers are selling at this point in time is not the same thing that we saw with historical slavery, kidnapping people or buying them after they'd been captured in a war or something like that. But rather, it's almost an individual relationship. That recruiter that comes, the person who says, send your kids to Port-au-Prince and I'll let them go to school, or whatever that is. And really what's happening is that the traffickers are tapping into that dream, a dream of a better life, a dream of opportunity. So what happens is the traffickers look at who's on society's margins, who's in a place where the police aren't necessarily looking out for their interests, whether it's minority group, disability, etc. And those are the people that end up getting victimized.
Joy.
Always, if you look at 3/4 of people who migrate, they are always from developing countries or underdeveloped economies, and they are looking for better opportunities in developed society. That's why majority of the source countries, almost all the source countries, are from this category of developing nations.
David.
You know, to be poor in this world means you do not get access to justice in the same way that those who are more privileged. And so when you look in the world where you have people who do not get the respect from people in uniform who should practice justice, or people within the court system who would give the rights that all people merit, you do not get that when you're poor and vulnerable. And so therefore, if we really want to fight trafficking in the world today, we also have to look at economic vulnerability.
You know, we've had a population explosion. The number of people who live in exactly the sorts of situations that David just explained, where the lack of rule of law for protection, where corruption is very high, means that they are extremely vulnerable. But it means that the cost of acquiring a slave isn't anything like it was in the past, which on average was around $40,000 in today's money. And today it's down to about $90,000.
I want to go and look at another clip now, because much of the world's anti-slavery focus has been on women forced into prostitution, but we discovered that the world doesn't always speak with one voice on something as seemingly straightforward as sex trafficking.
M-a legat de pat, i-am zis că nu. M-a legat de pat, ne-a legat mâinile și picioarele, m-a îmbrăcat și ne-a spus că asta eu am plătit bani, precum că îți fac viza, că am plătit în pașaport să pun viza.
This is the story of a trade in human flesh, a global trafficking industry that ruins the lives of millions of young women every day of every year.
Around the world, our best estimate is 27 million people in slavery. Globally, 6 or 8% is my guess, sex trafficking.
Today, the trail of trafficked women most often ends in the rich and liberal countries of Western Europe, but it begins in the poor and underdeveloped former Soviet bloc nations, and one country in particular, the Republic of Moldova.
În principiu, noi în Republica Moldova ce avem? Este o țară de origine a potențialelor victime traficului de ființe umane. Și este țara celor mai multe fete exploatate sexual în străinătate.
Less than a day's drive away, one country and one city above all positively celebrate the economics of demand for prostitution. In 2000, the Dutch government took the radical step of legalizing prostitution, ostensibly as a means to prevent women being trafficked and forced into the sex industry. Prostitution earns Holland 660 million euros every year. 4 million tourists flock to Amsterdam, most to stare at and often patronize the prostitutes working in its neon-lit windows.
We got girls from Albania. I mean, how can a girl from Albania, out of a village, I don't know where from, know her way to Amsterdam, know where to live, know how to rent a window? There must be an organized crime behind it.
Every year, the US government publishes a report which judges every country in the world on its efforts to stamp out slavery. The Trafficking in Persons, or TIP report, ranks countries that do the most as Tier 1. The State Department has always given Tier 1 status to Holland, despite the vehement opposition of John Miller.
I have visited the red light district. I've seen the young men with the leather jackets standing outside those windows, counting who goes in and making sure they get all the profits. All I can say is, I didn't think, according to our law, that they were Tier 1.
Holland believes that it has the best system of dealing with the worst excesses of sexual slavery, and nowhere sums that up more than the city of Amsterdam. But look behind the windows, and does that proposition really hold up to scrutiny?
We thought in 2000 that the more liberal view to prostitution would stamp out trafficking, but that proved to be wrong. It is modern slavery. Trafficking human beings is a kind of modern slavery.
Until the rich Western countries address the demand for prostitution rather than profit from it, there will always be sex slaves behind these windows.
Kevin Bales, you have said that, taken as a whole, the issue of sex slavery is between 6 and 8% globally of total slavery. Why then does it seem to dominate the agenda so much?
Why are we having such a focus on trafficking into sexual exploitation? We do in a large part because that's what's covered the most in the media in the rich countries. I have to tell you, if you go to other countries, you won't find necessarily the same sorts of things, depending on which country you're talking about. Certainly in Southeast Asia, there'll be a lot about trafficking into prostitution, but not necessarily in Niger, not necessarily in other places. It's because it's the one that surfaced best, it makes great copy for TV or newspapers, and it's one that's also obviously horrific, and one that we need to think very carefully about. I was just wishing that you had more to say in that clip about how we bring that demand to the end. The last sentence you said was, we won't fix it until we stop the demand. Now we need probably a lot of talk about how we do that.
Joy, I mean, how do we stop this demand?
If countries have the right laws, the legal framework, you have to criminalize trafficking. That is important. And some, for those who run brothels, those who keep prostitutes, those who exploit prostitution of others, then we have to deal with that. Those who commodify women as sex objects and make profit out of them, we have to deal with that.
Ambassador De Backer, Holland says that it has introduced its law legalizing prostitution for the best intentions. But do you think that actually now it is part of the problem of trafficking into sexual exploitation, into sex slavery?
Unlike in Holland, prostitution is illegal here in the United States, and we still have a trafficking problem.
But do you think in Holland's specific case it's part of the problem?
Regardless of whether or not trafficking exists, prostitution is going to exist as long as men think that it's appropriate to go buy women. Countries that make it legal, there's trafficking. Countries that make it illegal, there's trafficking.
But which do you think is a system that is better in this context?
The American system is to make all of the people that are involved with prostitution illegal. That's what we do here in the United States. There's plenty of other systems around the world. What we're focused on is, are they investigating and prosecuting trafficking cases?
But do you think Holland should remain in Tier 1, given that situation?
Holland is in Tier 1 this year. Hundreds of victims identified. Many, many cases being done in both sex and labor. We stand by that ranking just as we stand by every other ranking.
David.
Yeah, Not For Sale has an operation in the Netherlands, and Toos Heemsker, who was in that last clip, is our director. Our on-the-ground research shows that 7 out of 10 women behind those windows come from 3 countries, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania. And that a high preponderance of them maybe came at some level thinking that they would get a Western dream of a better life. But once they were there, they're managed. You go to the red light district, you'll see pimps, johns, traffickers. You'll see the pimps and traffickers managing and otherwise threatening their presence there. So we really need to come up with a better solution than what Netherlands has come up with.
Can I ask all of you a much wider question? Because we're talking about slavery, but this word trafficking keeps coming up. Now, 27 million slaves in the world is the figure, most widely agreed, but many of those don't get trafficked across borders. They remain within the country in which they are being enslaved. Do you think that this issue of slavery, somehow trafficking is covering up what it really is, which is slavery?
Well, we use euphemisms to talk about slavery. We used euphemisms 150 years ago. People called it the peculiar institution and things like that because they didn't want to say the word slavery. Before the year 2000, I was the involuntary servitude and slavery coordinator at the Justice Department. We called it what it was. But the international term came in, and I think the consensus that needs to be done at the UN, getting that many countries to agree on a term, I think what ended up happening was that people had to water down the concept enough so that everybody could swallow it.
I mean, would you like to, for example, your department to be renamed to the, the department that monitors and combats slavery?
Hillary Clinton said it best when she talked to the cabinet last year. She said, why don't we just call this what it is? It's slavery.
There you go.
Joy.
In the end, it is slavery. And we need to begin to call it that. And that's why increasingly you're seeing the modern day slavery. But in terms of nomenclature, it has always been mixed up like that. Because if you look at the definition of even human trafficking in person, as it contained in the Palermo Protocol, it also used slave-like practices similar to slavery, servitude. So it is all that same notion that we're talking about.
David, I mean, using euphemisms waters down this issue, doesn't it? I mean, that's the bottom line.
Absolutely. To this audience, if I say who here is in favor of slavery, of course not one hand would go up. And if your hand did go up, you'd be publicly shamed. But if I said who here is in favor of human trafficking, typically what happens in an audience, well, immigration, we have to be able to protect our borders, jobs at home. We really make it a murky topic. I really do believe the moral clarity we need to end this issue is to call it slavery.
Kevin.
Face it, trafficking is simply a process by which a person is placed into slavery. If they don't end up in slavery at the end, it's not called trafficking, it's called smuggling.
I'd like to introduce Claire Hanous, who's in the audience and appeared in our first program looking at the alleged enslavement of Thai farm workers here in the United States. Claire represents about 100 of the former Thai workers here. Claire, when you deal with law enforcement officials here in the United States who are at the cutting edge of this issue, is there an awareness that this is just point-blank slavery? Are they aware of it?
No. I think it's been very inconsistent. What we've seen in Hawaii is you really have to be careful who you go to bring trafficking victims forward. If you go forward, I've had cases I've been involved in, not the Thai cases, but other cases where they came before Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and instead of being protected, they were detained. And so the whole kind of law enforcement paradigm, I think, especially for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, enforcing immigration laws has always meant detaining and deporting people who were in unlawful status, instead of really looking deeper into what circumstances brought them to that unlawful status. And sometimes law enforcement means protecting laws that are designed to help victims. And I think that's a really hard pill for some of these people to swallow and to understand.
How do you get past that situation where, law enforcement agencies right across the board know what they're dealing with when lawyers like Claire bring a case forward?
I think part of it is that we have to now move from this past decade of developing all of these structures, but at the end of the day, it's the cop on the street who's going to see a trafficking victim, and at that point is either just going to keep going or is going to understand what it is he or she is seeing. And I think that that's our challenge, to take this decade of development and turn it into a decade of delivery.
Welcome back to Decatur House and to the Al Jazeera debate on modern slavery. This next clip actually points to the extent to which slavery is all around us and is very much part of our everyday life. Let's take a look at this.
Nearly 2,000 kilometers from Brazil's capital, the state of Pará is still plagued by slavery. Here, the fragile ecosystem of the Amazon rainforest is rapidly being destroyed by illegal deforestation. And behind the deforestation, one of the dirtiest and most degrading forms of slavery, charcoal burning.
A gente começou mexendo, assim, por causa do... O carvão criou alto valor, né? E até hoje mesmo o desemprego aqui dentro de Jacundá mesmo tá difícil. Aí a gente tem que trabalhar para manter o dia a dia da gente. Ou pouco ou muito, o pouco que vir, seja bem-vindo. Se vier muito também, é bem-vindo, né?
Pinto Lopez was a carbonizer at the charcoal farm. He loaded the ovens with wood and for months at a time breathed in the smoke-filled air.
Nós não tinha proteção de nada, nem máscara, nem calçado, nem a caneleira, nem capacete. O barraco lá era uma casa de tábua, não tinha energia, não tinha freezer, não tinha fogão, não tinha banheiro e não tinha água encanada. Vem muitos problemas na saúde.
José Augustus dos Santos was also enslaved at the charcoal farm.
A calvoaria é dos piores serviços para mim que existe, dos mais pesados. Então o dinheiro fica pesado quando tu pega dele, né? Que como nós estávamos no mato, você entra no mato, né? Eu acho que a maioria sabe o que é mato. Entra no mato, cortava, tudo relando de garranchos. Peguei 2 malaras constitutivas, inclusive voltei doente, né?
And did the employers give you any assistance, whether it was because of getting malaria or food, or if someone else got sick? Did you have any help from the employers in the work?
Não. Nada. Só serviço.
Charcoal is big business in Brazil's booming economy. It's the vital ingredient in an industry which earns $2 billion a year. Every year, Brazil exports around 10 million tons of pig iron, a key ingredient in the worldwide production of steel, and charcoal is the first stage in that chain. Transparency in supply chains is essential for ensuring that slave labor is not being used to make products that end up in consumers' homes. But ultimately, it is up to governments to enforce legislation and penalties. If they don't, then men like Jose and Hai will continue to be enslaved.
Well, I want to put to you, Joy, a question that's been sent in by one of our viewers, Sue Guire, and she asks, is the commodification of humanity an inevitable outcome in a capitalist world economy in crisis?
I would say, actually, I've addressed this issue that the current economic crisis, for example, is escalating trafficking in human beings. And when you look at the capitalist entrepreneurs, it's always about maximizing profit, cutting corners. It's not about the welfare of individual or society or community. It is survival of the fittest.
David, you've done an enormous amount of work on this area of consumers and the economic integration of slavery. Nobody likes slavery, but we all like cheap products in the shops when we go for T-shirts or shoes or whatever else. Does this practice actually lower prices, on goods?
Does it affect the price? I was with a group of growers in America, in the United States, lettuce, tomato, and tobacco. It was a gathering of the growers, the retailers that use those crops, and then as well the brokers. What was really fascinating to me as we talked about who here really wants to enslave someone, everyone said, of course not, we need to end this practice. But then it came to, well, who's going to pay for it? The growers say to the retailers, you need to pay us more. The retailers say, well, the consumers are really price conscious. If we change our price, they won't buy our products. You know who pays for our indiscretion today? It's the most vulnerable. It's those who can be taken advantage of. It's the poor, it's those who are enslaved.
Kevin, do you agree with this issue that, slavery distorts the economy and actually drives prices down in any sense?
For the most part, around the world, when we're talking about large-scale commodities, cocoa, cotton, timber, charcoal, steel, cassiterite, and so forth, those respond to the global market price.
Right.
And that global market price is not set by the slaveholders, and it's not set usually even by the consumers. In some ways, it's set by those who are dealing with it in the great markets in London and New York and Shanghai and so forth. Now, in that situation, there's a lot of profit for slaveholders.
I'd like us to look at just one more clip, which asks the question, who really is benefiting from slavery? And it looks at the question of prison slaves in China.
"250 years ago, the slave trade looked like this. Today, this is the face of slavery. China is the world's factory. Once an isolationist communist state, Over the past 20 years, it has become the biggest exporter of consumer goods anywhere on the planet. And a huge proportion of those exports come to America.
This is just a small part of the enormous docks in Los Angeles, which stretches along 43 miles of coastline, and it's where just under half of all United States imports from China enters the country. And in 2010, the United States imported just under $250 billion worth of goods.
But behind at least part of the economic miracle of modern China are an estimated 5.5 million men and women locked up in prison and forced to labor.
In China, the government says, we are going to be able to make billions of dollars per year if we convert the prison system into a factory system.
China has the biggest penal colony in the world, a top-secret network of more than 1,000 slave labor prisons and camps known collectively as the Laogai.
We were locked in prison. We were not paid at all. If anybody refused to work, they would be beaten.
This is one of the products Charles Lee says he was forced to make. Novelty slippers in the shape of the American cartoon character Homer Simpson. He particularly noticed the product information label sewn into each shoe.
The label is in English, it's not in Chinese. It was designed to export to Western countries, not sell in China.
US federal law bans the importation of any prison-made products. But to Harry Wu, who has devoted his life to exposing prison labor slaves in China's Laogai, there's little sign that Washington wants to enforce this when so much Chinese trade is at stake. Certainly in the past 15 years, there have been fewer than 20 attempts by US Customs to enforce the law.
Here is a country which has decided to flood the world with very inexpensive products. A great number of those are actually produced by enslaved people who are in prison. That has to be called state-sponsored slavery.
China's deliberate policy of using prisoners as slaves to boost the profits for Chinese export companies continues unchecked, and Western governments remain reluctant to rock the economic boat. As long as the world's consumer markets place a higher value on cheap products than they do on human life, the misery of 5 million prison slaves locked up behind these walls will continue.
I'd like to introduce Harry Wu, who's in the audience with us. Harry, you've devoted a large part of your life on this question of how China uses prison slaves as part of its export economy. Why do you think it's been so difficult to get effective international action on this?
First of all, I have to tell you that I was working as slavery in China 19 years. In the last 10 years, 1990s, Americans have the law forbidding the products come from China, and a couple of American companies was punished by American court. But since 2000 until today, almost nothing. Today, many Christmas lights, garments, the prisoner never stopped to work. But unfortunately, well, the administration not going to work on it because they just want to have a cheap labor force, make the cheap products benefit America, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Harry. Ambassador De Backer, is China too big to be put on the spot about this issue of slavery in its prisons?
Not at all. But at the end of the day, on the human trafficking and the slavery issue, much of what needs to be done in China is fairly easy. They need to change their law.
But do you confront them on that? I mean, raising the question is one thing, but actually following through with decisive action is a completely different thing.
Very much so. What we're working on, what we're encouraging them to do through their academic legal system, through the folks who write laws in the various parliamentary bodies, etc.
But it's encouraging something that you can really do with China. Let's be honest.
It very much is, because China needs to be able to export to the United States, to Western Europe, etc. But we're going to have to continue to pressure the Chinese. Otherwise,
but will you ask them to visit these prisons, for example? You're in a position to be able to do that.
I'm actually not the part of the government that does that. But the folks
But
from
do you want to see that
the
happen?
folks from the customs enforcement, they're there, they work with the Chinese. It's something that continues to be part of what we put pressure on the Chinese for.
But you're not in any doubt that this practice is something that should be condemned?
I'm not, at this point, prepared to talk about
There's
this
one thing that
particular
was
thing.
left out of the report, even though it's a great report, good job. But it's the fact that not that everyone would object to anyone who'd been convicted of a crime in a normal rule of law due process situation might have a job to do in prison. But a very large number of the people in those prisons, and this is what makes it special and a crime that I can condemn, are not there because of due process. They've not been actually convicted. Some have only been arrested. Some of them haven't been arrested. They've just been sent to prison.
Joy, what can the United Nations do?
There is an obligation on every government to exercise due diligence to ensure that we don't have this kind of situation. We have to prevent trafficking. We know, of course, that legally speaking, people who are in prison could do forced labor. But when also that becomes a process of export and commercialization of that labor and exploitation of them, because I'm sure they are not getting the profit, they are not getting any benefit from this, then it is really should be condemnable by all right-thinking person, and we should investigate this further. And if I have opportunity to go to China on a country visit,
but it just seems with the issue of China is, I mean,
this further to make
but
sure.
once investigate and discuss and cajole is one thing, but with China, there's a lack of action.
Well, investigate and discuss and cajole is another word for diplomacy. That's what, when we're talking about the United Nations, when you're talking about the United States, that's what we do. We don't arrest other countries. We arrest traffickers, but what we do is we name and shame, and this notion of putting pressure on each other, putting pressure on other governments to effectuate change doesn't necessarily seem as robust as raiding a ship or raiding a factory, but it's diplomacy, and I think that it does work.
Kevin, do you agree, or do you think human rights is coming off worse in this equation?
Well, I mean, human rights do come off worse in this equation. We know that. I don't think there's any disagreement about that. But in addition to challenging or pressurizing any governments, I've also got to look to consumers on this, because I have to flip. I have to do a little flip-flop here and say, when they fix this problem, if they do in China, prices will go up for American consumers, and they should. And American consumers should be looking at these products and saying, how on earth can I actually buy an entire table lamp for $3 and not assume that probably there's slave labor in there? And that's probably going to be more motivating to the Chinese government than any pressure put on even by someone as robust as Lou and the other members of the State Department. Because when they see the orders fall, they're going to have to start thinking that through.
I want to go to a question from one of our viewers, and it points to the fact that the United Nations was behind the first international legislation outlawing slavery about 100 years ago. But this question from a student in the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa asks, what precisely is preventing the UN from achieving its goals towards the eradication of slavery in the 21st century?
The UN is made up of a committee of the nations. It's a member state that form the bulk of the work. And what UN, the place of UN is to set agenda. They also set the normative framework. They have the institutional mechanism to monitor and ensure, and they also provide policy and practical directives. Every country, every government want to be seen as against slavery, because they know, of course, slavery has ended, but we know that the modern form of slavery manifests and lives with us and is everywhere, and every country is affected. But the real action and whether they are taking the right steps is where the problem is. So, and implementation is weak and fragmented, and that is the problem.
Right. I've got you. Kevin.
Well, if we're going to put pressure on China, we need to put pressure on the UN as well. I mean, let's face facts. Remember, the UN is not the democracy we tend to think it is. Most of the decisions are made at the Security Council, and the Security Council has never taken up this issue. They have never made this a key point that they're going to push along throughout the General Assembly and the rest of the large United Nations mechanisms. And we have all sorts of things within the United Nations waiting to be used as a weapon to bring the eradication of slavery.
But why isn't it then?
I'm going to point to one. The same one that was used in Iraq to look for weapons inspection, for weapons of mass destruction. We have a convention against it, so we have inspectors that look for those weapons. We have a convention against slavery. Where are our slavery inspectors?
Well, why is that then? What are the factors behind the fact that there are no inspectors looking for slaves, as the analogy you pointed out?
I would say that within the United Nations system, it is always a softly approach, in large part because there are significant numbers of countries within the United Nations and on the Security Council, like China, who do not want to be pushed along too fast on this issue because it works nicely within their power relations as a country.
Do you feel that there is an impotence at the heart of this issue for the United Nations, though, as an institution, Joy?
I think so, and then I agree. They have to be the leadership, and they have to be not just political support, but economic will to end slavery.
Are you satisfied that enough action has been taken to change the situation for what is, let's face it, 27 million people around the world who this evening, now as we speak, are still in a situation of slavery?
To solve it? No. There's 27 million people who are enslaved.
Trapped.
To fight it, it gives us something. It's no longer the United States coming and saying, you have a slavery problem, you have to deal with it. We have to eradicate slavery. But are we there right now? No.
Kevin Bales, do you think we can talk about eradicating slavery, and what would it cost to actually do that?
We can absolutely talk about eradicating slavery. If you take what it costs now to bring people out of slavery and you sort of average it across all the people who are in slavery, it comes to about $10.5 billion, probably spent over a 25 to 30 year period, if we were able to spend that much. There's a lot of ifs in that. But and it might go up to 20 with inflation and over a 25-year period, but the point is, that's in the global economy, that's chicken feed.
It's chicken feed. But I mean,
and just so you know, my office's budget this year got cut to $16 million for programs around the world. So I think that's, 100 times less than what you just said that we need to spend? That comes out to about 70 cents per slave. So that notion
that's quite
of...
a statistic.
The $10.5 billion is about what Americans spend on blue jeans in a year.
David Batstone.
Yeah, I think it needs a complete reframing, even to think, I mean, I get asked all the time, what is the UN doing, or what is X government doing? I really do believe it has to be inspired and engendered by grassroots, NGOs, communities, people from the bottom, which then allows someone like Ambassador Dabaka, I mean, he's got wind at his back then within his own government system, within the UN, to act even more bravely and actually more effectively. But it all comes back to people owning the problem in their own community. And in a sense, what I call is democratizing capital. We've talked about capitalism as a problem. Well, it's crony capitalism, which is a real problem, but one of the solutions that Not for Sale is bringing to this is how do we deploy capital in communities that have never seen capital or don't have access to capital. So we need to rethink these kind of notions from a Cold War era around what social change might mean, and rethink what unleashing what you might call a freedom dividend, what would that look like to unleash communities who now can participate for the first time in a global economy?
Okay, I'd now like to go to another question from the audience.
What's the greatest barrier to intergovernmental collaboration to address modern-day slavery and human trafficking?
Ambassador Dabaka.
I think one of the biggest barriers to intergovernmental is this notion of the trafficking problem only being dealt with within the context of the individual country.
Got also, I mean, situations to be blunt, Ambassador. I mean, when I was in Pakistan, that I came across again and again, that in this area of the brick kiln factories, you had actual politicians who were, at the national level, who were part and parcel of this practice.
Yes.
David.
Yeah, take a country like the Philippines, where I met with senators there, and they wanted some assistance in coming up with a national plan. And I said, well, regionally in the provinces, what kind of support do you think we could get from local politicians and from law enforcement? So the problem is that a high preponderance of those who are supposed to practice the rule of law are actually benefiting financially from these relationships. So that is a challenge.
The law enforcement agents, whether you're talking of the police, the border guards, immigrations, sometimes don't even know what we're talking about. What is trafficking? What are the international framework? Even understanding their own law. That is why if we have to combat trafficking effectively, we must also deal with that capacity gap. There is also coordination gap, the referral mechanisms. Some will not know what to do, who to refer to. And in some countries, you just find just 2 experts, 1 expert even, dealing with this issue. So we need to ensure scale up training activities, training of law enforcement officers, but we shouldn't stop with the police. We should also include labor inspectors.
It's an issue, this question of worldwide slavery, that can sometimes make an individual feel just overwhelmed by it, as much as people might be against it. I want to go to a question by Brandon Mann.
Yeah, what is the best way for an average person to take a stand against modern-day slavery?
David Batstone.
Yeah, you know, I think it's when we start changing our own lives that other people have the chance to simply live. And that's why we created this app on your phone that you're able to scan the barcode on any product and then you get a grade. You know now, why would you buy that product? I don't want to wear people suffering. I want to consume their tragedy or trod on their dreams with my shoes. I want to live differently.
Do you think consumer pressure is the way to go forward, or holds the key, perhaps answering this question?
It's a small part of it. It's an important part, but I have to say, if you want to answer Brandon's question and say, how do we, actually bring slavery to an end and get out there in the big way, it's about getting people out of slavery. It's about getting people out of slavery. And the two big things that we face are awareness and resources, a shortage of both of those. So I say, what a person needs to do is to read and learn and tell others about it so that they spread this awareness around. And then think about how their resources can go to those people on the front line who are actually getting people out of slavery. It's one thing to pick a different type of sneaker, but if you actually want to pay for a month or 2 months or a year's worth of work of someone risking their life to get people out of slavery for the price of those sneakers, I think it's a better deal.
In many ways, how does this level of engagement ever going to change life for the 3 generations of the family that we saw earlier in Pakistan, whose grandfather died there, he's seen his, children there, and he himself there. How do we change those people's lives?
Companies and politicians alike spend an awful lot of money for polling, for consumer research firms, all that other stuff to find out what we all want. And if we start saying back to them in no uncertain terms that what we want is a slave-free world, and anybody who doesn't give it to us, we're not going to buy their product, we're not going to vote for them, etc. I do think that we'll start to see that systemic change. It's got to come from the top, from the bottom, from the middle. We all have to fight slavery.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, that brings to an end our debate here on Al Jazeera on 21st century evil modern slavery. I'd like to thank, first of all, our audience for being here with us. Thank you very much. And also our viewers watching, but also especially to our panelists. If you give them a big round of applause, to Ambassador Louis de Baca, to Kevin Bales, Joy Ezeilo, and also to David Batstone. Thank you very much and good night.